Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. The case of Richard Trenton Chase is a story which even the most depraved horror writer would struggle to create. Over the course of 4 weeks spanning across 1977 and 1978, Richard Chase took the lives of 6 innocent victims in Sacramento, California. Hey guys, welcome to a chilling journey into the depths of true crime. I'm your guide on this unsettling adventure, and today we unravel the haunting tale of a man who became the stuff of nightmares, Richard Chase, the infamous vampire of Sacramento. Before we dive into the macabre details, I want to extend a warm welcome to both seasoned true crime enthusiasts and those who are stepping into the world of criminal mysteries for the first time. Brace yourselves, for the story we're about to unfold is as dark as it is intriguing. And of course, make sure you've subscribed and hit that notification bell to stay updated on our dive into the abyss. Born on May 23, 1950 in Santa Clara, California, Richard Chase was thrust headfirst into a life of misery. From a young age, Richard was physically abused by his father. His parents would violently argue, with Richard being the unlucky recipient of his father's rage once his mother fled the house. By his teenage years, he had developed a dependency on drugs and alcohol. From this point, his serial killer tendencies quickly developed. Richard began torturing and mutilating small animals, including cats, he found around his neighborhood. By age 12, Richard displayed the 3 traits which are considered the blueprint for fledgling serial killers: bedwetting, animal cruelty, and arson. Struggling with severe mental issues and unable to forge any kind of life for himself, Richard's situation only worsened when he became an adult. Alone in his apartment, he would eat animals raw. Sometimes he liquefied their internal organs and drank the residue. By his early 20s, Richard believed that his heart was shrinking and consuming animal entrails would somehow keep him alive. In 1975, Richard injected himself with rabbit's blood, resulting in a severe case of blood poisoning. Following this incident, he was admitted to a mental institution. However, Richard escaped in 1976 but was apprehended again and sent to a hospital for the criminally insane. It was here where Richard's vampiric tendencies were fully exposed. He regularly discussed his blood-drinking fantasies with other inmates, eventually earning himself the nickname Dracula. Officially released in late 1976 after being declared no longer a threat to society, Richard immediately returned to his previous life. He caught neighborhood pets, drank their blood, and one time even called a neighbor to inform him of the horrific things he'd done to his dog. Richard Chase's delusions grew further, which now combined with murderous impulses to create a highly volatile, dangerous monster. It would be on December 29, 1977, that Richard Chase committed his first murder. Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old gentleman, dropped dead outside his Sacramento home. Richard Chase had driven by and fired a .22 caliber pistol randomly in Ambrose's direction. There was no rhyme or reason to Ambrose's murder. He wasn't targeted for any reason. Ambrose Griffin simply found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Casings were discovered near the Griffin home, however. Nothing pointed to a suspect. Richard continued to wander the streets of Sacramento by night. On January 11, 1978, he approached the door of a woman named Jean Layton. He simply walked up to her patio door and pulled the handle. Finding it locked, however, Richard then tried the windows instead. Also locked. But perhaps the most unnerving part of all this was that Jean Layton watched the whole thing. She saw a disheveled, long-haired man arrive at her door, then move to her windows, then back to her door. It was here that she met Richard Chase face to face through the glass partition, but Richard gave nothing away. He stared into Jean's eyes, lit a cigarette, then walked away, later claiming that locked doors mean you aren't welcome. The same night, Richard did find an open door. The home belonged to Robert and Barbara Edwards. When they pulled onto their driveway after grocery shopping, a man exited their home by their rear window. From the shadows, Richard Chase ran past them, cradling handfuls of valuables he had stolen from their home. Robert Edwards followed Richard as far as he could, but Richard leaped over a fence and disappeared into the night. When detectives inspected the Edwards household, they discovered that Richard had not only taken valuables, but had also urinated in a drawer and defecated on their son's bed. While Richard escaped, the night still wasn't over. Something equally strange happened next. Nancy Holden, a young woman, had been shopping that evening in a nearby center. As she was leaving one of the stores, an unkempt man approached, who she believed to be homeless. The man walked up to her and asked, "Were you on the motorcycle when Kurt was killed?" Nancy was stunned. 10 years before, she had indeed dated someone named Kurt who died in a motorcycle accident. However, she had no idea who the strange man was. It wasn't until Richard said, "It's me, Rick Chase," that Nancy realized who she was talking to. He looked nothing like she remembered. Richard was an old school friend of Nancy's, but it was clear that Richard had struggled through a difficult life. He was clearly nervous, craving a drug hit, and his clothes were ridden with stains. Nancy made her excuses, but Richard followed her to her car. He begged her for a lift. However, Nancy quickly made her escape. It would be on January 23, 1978, that Richard Chase found his next unlocked door. Inside the home at 2360 Tioga Way was a woman named Teresa Wallen. 3 months pregnant and home alone, Richard entered the residence as Teresa was taking out her garbage. When she returned, Richard Blitz attacked her with the same .22 he'd used to kill his previous victim. One bullet entered her palm, and the second through the peak of her skull. She fell to the floor, dying instantly. Alone with her corpse, Richard could now act out his disturbing fantasies without fear of interruption, and he did. Richard pulled Teresa's corpse into her bedroom, then repeatedly raped her. He mutilated her with a butcher's knife, stabbing her in the lungs, liver, stomach, and breasts. He removed her left nipple, tore her pancreas, took out her kidneys, and left her intestines hanging outside of her body. He then collected her blood in a yogurt pot. He drank it, then smeared some over his face. But before he left her dissected body for her husband to find, Richard stuffed Teresa's mouth with dog feces he found outside. On January 27, 1978, Richard Chase reached peak rampage. It would be the night Richard Chase elevated himself from serial killer to mass murderer. He broke into the home of Evelyn Maroth, a 38-year-old woman. Evelyn was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira. Also in the home was Evelyn's 6-year-old son, Jason, and a neighbor named Dan Meredith. 4 people were home, none would come out alive. Richard walked into the hallway and shot Dan execution style in the head with his .22 caliber. Hearing the blast, 6-year-old Jason fled upstairs, where Richard followed him, eventually shooting him twice in the same manner. On the way, Richard also shot 22-month-old David in the head. Only Evelyn was left alive. Richard found her in the bathtub, clearly terrified by the multiple gun blasts. There, Richard shot Evelyn once. The news of the murders reached the mainstream press. Police and FBI appealed for information, and unfortunately for Richard, one person immediately suspected him, Nancy Holden, Richard's school friend, who he approached a few weeks earlier. In police reports, it was mentioned that a strange man was seen near Teresa Wallen's home wearing an orange parka, and it was the same clothing Richard wore the day he spoke to Nancy. Authorities checked out Richard Chase and found he matched the profile almost perfectly. The FBI visited Richard at his home with the intention of bringing him into custody. However, Richard wouldn't go quietly. He refused to open the door to them, so FBI officers pretended to leave the scene. In reality, they hid out of sight and waited for Richard to come out. When he did, he was carrying a small box. The officers immediately apprehended him. Inside the box were piles of blood-stained cloth. They also discovered Dan Meredith's wallet in Richard's pocket. While this was evidence enough to send him to trial, what they found in Richard Chase's apartment cemented his guilt. His walls and floors were caked with dried bloodstains, as were his utensils and kitchen equipment. Animal remains and internal organs were found in his fridge, alongside several human organs belonging to Teresa Wallen, Evelyn Maroth, and the young boy David. Richard Chase's game was over. After a short trial, Richard was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. Unfortunately, Richard Chase never quite made it that far. On December 26, 1980, he was discovered dead in his prison cell after overdosing on antidepressants.